Hey everybody, welcome to the final seminar of this talk in room 1A. Room 1A is a very special room. I've been bonded to this room. When I got the option to host or moderate these panels, I picked the first and very last one, both here in room 1A, because I knew that it would be sponsored by a very dear friend, Mark James of Farm Bureau. Who's Mark James? What's the Farm Bureau? Well, hey, Mark James, come on up.
God, I feel like I gotta hug the guy, for God's sakes. So, hey, Chris, thanks for inviting me up here, and we're glad to host this room and sponsor this room. For those of you who don't know about Farm Bureau, we're a grassroots advocacy organization. We've had a relationship with the New York State Brewers Association for probably almost 20 years. You know, I remember going with Dave Kadaleski to a room in a hotel in Syracuse, and there were like 10 guys sitting around drinking beer. That was the Brewers Association. And look at what they've become today. But so we're involved in a lot of different issues supporting the breweries in New York State. The local level, you know, I was talking to somebody today about local zoning and stuff, and I'll tell you, it's really troubling when some of these towns, we complain about the state and national governments, but some of these towns are just brutal on trying to promote business in their town. They put all these restrictions on. So we get involved in some of those things. You know, I was involved in one where they were prohibiting outdoor music, but they let them do that for 10 years until somebody complained, and then they said, no, you can't do it anymore. So we got involved and got that issue resolved. The state level, one of the things that we're pushing as a priority issue this year, right now, wineries have the ability to sell their wine at farm markets, not farmers markets. That you can do that too, but you know, a farm stand. But you know, beer, cider, and distilled spirits can't be. And so we're pushing legislation right now to allow breweries and cideries and distilleries to be able to sell their product at farm markets within a 20-mile radius. So we really want to help you guys open up your market to other places as well. At the national level, I know the big issue right now is tariffs. And that's something we're pushing back on in our statement that we sent out to the press. Not only did we cite the impact of tariffs on farmers, but we singled out the craft beer industry because we know that it's between the malt prices, you know, tariffs on malt, tariffs on aluminum, it's going to really put some hurt on you guys. So we're trying to push back on that and get that resolved. So we're continuing to do that moving forward. But I really want to talk about our beer. This is the first ever New York Farm Bureau beer. This is an idea that Kristen Lunkenheimer from Lunkenheimer Craft Brewing came up with. She serves on the Cuyahoga County Farm Bureau Board of Directors. And so we had some money that came in, and we said, you know, what can we do with that money? And she goes, why don't we brew a Farm Bureau beer? And so we ended up getting everything donated for this, including the packaging. So what we're going to do is we're selling this. We have a press conference next week. We're going to start selling this in 8 breweries in the Finger Lakes. Those are the breweries that are participating in the collaboration beer. And all the proceeds from this are going to go to the Food Bank of Central New York and FoodLink. So we've got some promotional videos that we're getting out there. We're holding a press conference next week. We want to, you know, we did this to recognize farmers and the ingredients that they put forth to make beer. We wanted to recognize breweries and their importance and drive people into breweries during a slow time of year. And obviously we wanted to do it for a good cause, so that's why we're doing it for the food bank. So this is a 100% New York ingredient cream ale, and hope you'll stop by and try some of it. It's really, really good. We're getting some great reviews on this. So yeah, stop by and we can talk more about Farm Bureau. I'll be around all evening through the awards program, so if you want to chat with me a little bit, if you want to sign up as a Farm Bureau member night, please do. So, Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Chris, and being as this is the last seminar that we're probably all going to take, I'd be remiss not to thank all the sponsors for doing this, and thank all of you for being here. And thanks for engaging with all the sponsors. We can't do this without you guys engaging with the sponsors. We can't do it without the sponsors. I had nothing to do with setting this up. I'm totally new to the board, so I'm proud of the work that they all did, and I'm happy to and excited for next year's project. Speaking of value for you, boy, today what a thing we have going on here in room 1A. We have Dr. Allison Lange, who is the R&D molecular biologist at Omega Yeast in Chicago. She graduated from Dartmouth College with a degree in genetics, cell, and development biology, and was awarded her PhD in biochemistry from Emory University. She then brewed professionally for about 9 years in the Washington, D.C. area. She began, the squiggly line, it's about squiggly line 9 years in the Washington, D.C. area. She began as a brewer and beer scientist at Port City Brewing Company, then moved to be the director of brewing operations, lead brewer, lead QC, and lead cellar person at 3 Stars Brewery. And most recently, she was head brewer at Old Ox Brewery. Now from Omega Yeast, Allison Lange.
Thank you. Sorry, my boss gives me crap when I say about 10 years, so about 9 years. Thanks for inviting me to come here. I'm really looking forward to telling you a little bit about how to set up some successful fermentations. There's 2 parts we're going to talk about, kind of the yeast side of it, so the yeast attenuation part, and then also setting the plate, so the work from fermentability and how you set it up. Chris did a great job of introducing me, so I won't pause too much here. Hopefully in the last 3 days you guys have stopped by our table and figured out who we are. We're a yeast lab out of Chicago, and we're just known for fast, fresh yeast. So like I said, we're going to be talking about how to set up a successful fermentation. So what does it actually mean? A lot of that depends on what kind of beer you want to make. If you're making a seltzer versus making an imperial stout, obviously you have very different goals for what kind of attenuation you want to get and what kind of fermentability you want to get. But we're going to talk about kind of strategies you can take to do either one of those. But in any case, the big thing is that the beer ends up being true to your intent, that you get complete fermentation, and that it's predictable, repeatable, that it's exactly what you want it to be. Like I hinted at, we're going to talk about 2 main pieces here. One is creating a wort that is fermentable in the way that you want, and the second is your yeast choice and the role that the yeast plays in your fermentation. And in the end, that obviously is going to make you a good beer. And then the third part of the talk is going to be some special situations. So the first parts are going to be a lot of review. I feel like a lot of people like being told things they already know because it makes them feel smart. So we're going to incorporate some of that just to give everyone background, and then kind of filter in a couple little hints and tricks here and there. Hopefully just stuff you haven't thought about in a while. It'll help you kind of think about your recipe development these days. The other part of this is one of the major questions that we get are issues with fermentability. So when you guys call up Adi, he's the one who always answers the phone. He's super helpful. He's amazing. He's our first employee. He has troubleshot so many things I can't even tell you. People will call us because their kettle element has blown, and they will ask us how to fix it, and we will walk you through that. Like, we will do whatever we can to help you guys. But the things we get most are questions about attenuation. So this is kind of to nip all those kinds of things in the bud and kind of teach you guys how to address these questions on your own. All right, so the first part is setting up the wort that you want. We're going to think about this as like setting up the dinner plate for your yeast. So the idea, all right, what is wort fermentability? We're talking about the conversion of starch molecules into fermentable sugars in the mash. And your goal is to provide the right ratio of sugars. And that kind of depends on what kind of beer you're making. But in general, your wort that you're making is going to be made up of 4 main sugars. And those are the ones we're going to focus on. Glucose, maltodextrose, maltose, and dextrins. Maltose is going to be the sugar that gets made the most. For the most part, that's about 50% of your wort. Glucose is going to be the most simple sugar. That's going to be about 20%. Maltodextrose will be which is 3 molecules together, is going to be about 10%. And then you're going to have an unfermentable component, and that's the dextrins. And those tend to be about 20% of your wort. The reason that this matters is that yeast ferment sugars differently. So depending on the kind of yeast that you have, you want to set the right kind of dinner plate for them. So if you are looking at just a total wild yeast that you capture out of the wild, it tends to just eat glucose. If you're looking at a lab strain, it wants to just eat sugars. They're simple. We, however, have been taken care of and manipulating brewing yeast for so long that we have, I guess fortunately, because what we want, taught them or selected for yeast that can eat much more complex sugars. And those involve, maltose, maltotriose, and dextrins. And depending on what kind of strain that you're picking, they can eat different ones of these sugars. Obviously, we also know that with diastatic yeast, they have an extra enzyme, and that's what allows them to digest dextrins into fermentable sugars. This obviously is impacted by your mash temperature, your mash pH, your diastatic power of your malt, and your liquor to grist ratio, and we're going to go into all of those. So the first thing is obviously all of the mash enzymes. There are tons of enzymes in the malt. We're not going to talk about all of them. Some of them are things like beta-glucanases, things that actually just open up the molecule and expose the starch. But we're going to focus on the ones that are actually acting upon the dextrins. So the first one is alpha amylase, and it's an enzyme that can cut anywhere along your dextrin chain. It can produce maltose, maltotriose, dextrins. It really can cut anywhere you want and can create chunks of all kinds of sizes. It's mainly for increasing your extraction rate and not necessarily your fermentability. You end up with lots of dextrins and higher residual extract. If you focus on beta amylase though, that only cuts from the end, and it just chomps from the end and cuts off maltose molecules. This is the way you get a super high fermentability. And then we also have limit dextrinase, and that when you have a chained dextrin molecule that has a bunch of, we'll go into, I'll show you some pictures, long chains that are actually branched with multiple long chains that are attached to each other, it will cut the chains apart. My boss thought that she had come up with this analogy on her own, but I'm sure you guys are familiar with John Palmer's How to Brew. He goes into sort of the idea of different sorts of lawn care items that are analogous to these enzymes. And I'm going to go ahead with Laura's version, but just so you know, thanks to John, because I'm sure that planted in her mind back in the day. So yeah, we have our tree. It's got a bunch of chains of dextrins. This is also referred to as an amylose molecule. So it's got chains of dextrins that are branched, and you have all these enzymes that can act upon it. Like I said, the first is this alpha amylase, and it can cut wherever it wants, and so you end up with these big chunks. I like visualizing this because otherwise I forget what all of them are. I remember reading John Palmer's thing 15 years ago, but this actually was a nice reminder. The second is the beta amylase, and it's like a wood chipper, and so it's like you're feeding it in from the end, and it will cleave off little bits of maltose. And then the last is the limbic dextrinase, and this isn't involved too much, but it is significant. It's like a pole saw, and so it just cuts between these branches and leaves the long branches. I'm sure you've seen this graph before, but the way that we can manipulate this is by manipulating the mash temperature. Obviously, if you're over towards the cold side, you're going to be, check this out, you're going to be over on this side. You're going to have higher fermentability, and you're going to be in the beta amylase region. That means that you're going to get highly fermentable wort because you're going to get a lot of maltase, a lot of really digestible sugars. But if you get over towards the warmer side of this kind of brewer's window, you're going to be in the alpha amylase section. You're going to increase your extract, but not be so fermentable. pH is obviously a big part of this as well. You want to make sure you're in the active range for your pH, for your enzymes. Just the idea that any enzyme, any protein isn't going to be happy if you're at a super low or a super high pH. So you want to be in this kind of sweet spot of kind of 5.3 to 5.7, and you can also kind of push it. Beta amylase is cool with a little bit of a lower pH. Alpha amylase wants you to be at least 5.3. So another kind of tool you can play with. So the consequences of that are this. So this is a graph that we took from this paper down here that shows you what happens when you have different mash in temperatures. So they did the exact same mash, but they did a single step infusion and held it at each one of these temperatures. And so I've highlighted one, I don't know Celsius, so I've highlighted the Fahrenheit thing down here, and the blue is kind of our brewer's window. You can see that at the lower ranges, you have higher levels of glucose. That's a super fermentable wort, but it's not very efficient because the thing that we want to make the most of is this maltose up here. So you can see right in the middle of that brewer's window is where you maximize maltose, which is 50% of our wort. So that's kind of where we want to act. And then as you get warmer, you get some of these larger sugars like the maltotriose. In addition to the kind of sugars that you get, You also have effects on, one, the extract percentage and the quality of your wort. So this is, again, Congress mashes going from colder to hotter, and then looking at either the extract percentage, the maltose, the fan, or the apparent attenuation. All right, and you can kind of see that in the top left there, that the extract percentage is relatively unaffected. So that's not going to be something that gets affected, but that your work quality, so all of these other measures like the fan, are greatly impacted by the temperature at which you work. So obviously once you get out of this brewer's window, you really tank. So you can kind of see how important all of that is. That comes into play if you're thinking about things like NA beers, which we will get into later, just something to keep in mind. It's also interesting to note that these are just 7 different malt samples. So malt varies wildly, and that's something that you guys want to keep an eye on. So make sure to talk to your maltster, use your COA, take a look. I mean, it'll tell you your diastatic power on there. And if you're working with something that's super efficient, that has a really high diastatic power, one of the consequences is that where you think you have some control here, you're going to have a little bit less control if you have a really diastatic malt. So if you have something that's a little more moderate, your temperature control, you're going to have a lot more levers to pull there. If something is super diastatic, it's going to convert it, like it just is. So just realize that you're going to have to be a little more careful about how you might be a little more extreme in your choices in order to get the effect that you think that you're going to get. You also have the option to use exogenous enzymes that are comparable to the kind of enzymes that you get in malt. They do make the fungal or bacterial versions of alpha amylase. That one is the one that can cut anywhere. And the idea is that if that's in like vast excess, that you really increase both your extraction and your attenuation. This is what macro brewers use to make like light beers. Because you get so much extraction, it's an extremely efficient way to work. So you get the most out of your malt, which, as far as cost savings, this is a great way to go about that. There aren't really any commercial versions of beta amylase. The limit dextranase, I never can pull off saying this word, so I'm not even going to try, but there is one. I also can't type the word brewery, which is insane. It's like one of those things my brain just like can't make happen. So anyway, that one. And then there is no malt enzyme equivalent, but I think we're all familiar with the idea of amyloglucosidase or glucosidase. And that's one that also trims from the end, but it cuts off glucose molecules. And so you end up again with a super highly fermentable wort. That's how people used to make brewed IPAs. Or if you just don't want to use the word brute, you can talk about it as like a craft version of like a Mick Ultra. Just a highly fermentable, like really dry wort. Your water grist ratio also matters. You want to stay in that sweet spot of between 1 to 2 quarts per pound. If you get too thick, the product actually can inhibit it. So if you get too much maltose in there, it actually inhibits the reaction. There's also just physical barriers to that. I mean, it's hard to stir. You guys know how it's a pain in the butt to work with, so you don't want to get too thick. But if you get too thin or too soupy, your enzymatic activity is slowed because you have too much of a dilution of the substrate. So it's just so spread out that the enzyme doesn't even see the sugar in order to cleave it. Other ways you can control your fermentation, like I just said, you can use exogenous enzymes. You can do a decoction. So that's a way where you can do multiple different rests in order to really hit the enzymatic zone in order to get every one of those enzymes doing what they want to do. And that's if you're trying to really increase your extraction. The other thing is you might get more extraction than you wanted. You might have a more fermentable wort than you wanted. And so one of the things is like, are you mashing out? Like, are you carrying over enzymatic activity into your kettle as it's filling, as you're lautering? So just make sure that that's one of the things that you're actually killing these enzymes. Because once you get to where we all sort of sparge, like 170-ish, that's right at the very end of that alpha amylase peak. It's down at the bottom. There's almost no activity. So you want to make sure you're hitting that 170. So how do you measure the fermentability of your wort? There's a couple of really complicated ways and one really easy way to at least estimate it. So the complicated way, the way that you end up with those graphs that I showed you earlier, where you can actually see the glucose and the maltose and the maltotriose, you can use either gas chromatography or HPLC, and that will quantify all of those things for you. Obviously, those are really expensive and they require chemists to run them. Maybe you're there, but I know a lot of breweries are not, and so I think the easiest way to make sure that you just haven't messed anything up is to do a forced fermentation. People will call us sometimes and they're frustrated because they're like, this does not mimic my brew, like my fermentation. Like it's on a stir plate, it's oxygenated, it's done in 2 days. Like maybe I'm off by a couple tenths of a degree of Plato. And I guess what we generally say to that is like, yeah, that's kind of the point. This is really just a sanity check. This is just to make sure that like you didn't mess anything up in a major way, right? That like you didn't accidentally dose way too much acid in there, that you didn't walk away during your mash and your temperature didn't like completely fluctuate. This is just a sanity check to see like if you're in the ballpark of where you want to end up. All right, so that was kind of the idea of setting the plate and the kind of sugars that you want to make, the kind of wort that you're going to make. But the second half of this equation is the yeast part of it. Obviously, that's the part that we like. So the reason this matters is yeast like to act in a certain order. They will consume all of the simple sugars first. So they'll eat the glucose, the fructose, the maltose, all the kind of smaller ones. And then they'll move on to all the larger, more complex molecules. So if they're able to do it, they will move on to the maltotriose, and then if it's a Sta plus organism, to the dextrins. And I showed you this earlier with regards to thinking about the sugars, but the reason this is important is, if you look at it from a yeast perspective, is that different yeast like to eat different things. So like I said, you got wild yeast over here. The majority of brewing yeast are really good at doing both glucose and maltose. Then you get into lager strains and some ales. They can also do maltotriose, and then diastatic yeast that can digest the dextrins into more fermentable chunks. Things to kind of note here are that there are yeasts that we use on an everyday basis that don't have the ability to utilize maltotriose. And the difference there is that the reason it's kind of relevant to our brewing practice is that something like a Chico can do a maltotriose, but something like some of the British ales, for example, can't use maltotriose. And so that's where we get kind of the really highly fermentable, like everyday ale strains we use, and the ones that have a little bit of a lower attenuation. So that's how you have like hazies, for example. You want to have some residual mouthfeel, you want to have some residual sugars. Those are ones that tend to fall into the category of not being able to utilize maltotriose. This is an idea of kind of how this all happens in the yeast cell. So out in the wort, you have all these different sugars, and your yeast has specialized transporters that can bring those into the cell. So it has what are called hexose transporters that can import both glucose and fructose. It has a maltose transporter that can import maltose. And then there are some multifunction ones that can do both maltose and maltotriose. There's also some enzymes that are extracellular. And so the yeast makes these and then they leave the cell. One, like what we've obviously been talking about, is the Sta glucoamylase. Cleaves dextrins into glucose. There's also something called SUC2, which is an invertase, and that splits sucrose into glucose and fructose. And again, sort of just to drive home this point, if you have something like a diastatic yeast that has all of this and can use all of those different sugars, if you lose the ability to have Sta1, then you can no longer use the dextrins. If you have something like those British strains, it's not all of them, but like that tends to be the trend, they don't have this importer, so they can't use maltotriose. And if you have just a basic wild strain, they also don't have this maltose importer, and that's the reason that they can't use maltose. Once all these sugars get into the cell, the way that the currency of the cell is glucose. So what happens is you take these bigger molecules of maltose and maltotriose, and there's a maltase enzyme, and that breaks it down into glucose, and that's what feeds into kind of all of your energy pathways in the cell. So when we're thinking about attenuation with yeast, one thing to keep in mind as we're talking about all of this is that when brewers talk about attenuation, we tend to mean apparent degree of fermentation and not real degree of fermentation. And the reason that matters is because you end up, when you look at just the ADF, or apparent degree of attenuation, you get weird numbers like this if you think about something like a seltzer. So 123% attenuation doesn't make any sense, right? And so the real degree of fermentation actually takes into account the fact that the alcohol produced doesn't have the same specific gravity as water, and so it will correct that back down to 100%. But what we usually do when we're measuring gravity and you're measuring Plato, starting Plato, finishing Plato, and doing the math backwards, you're going to end up with these numbers like 123%. And yeast companies and brewers tend to work with, for example, these kind of attenuation numbers, not the lower ones. So when you're looking through like a poster or a website or something like that, you're going to be seeing the ADFs, and just keep that in mind. If you're talking to people, like make sure you guys are talking about the same numbers. As for people like us, like yeast companies, like how do we estimate these attenuation ranges? I think every company probably does it differently, but it's a combination of just looking at some historical styles and the way things are made, and just sort of like how yeast have been used in the past and what the trends are. And then also a combination of experimentation where we have one standard wort that we make and then use it, brew with all the different strains, and then plot that. And so one thing to really keep in mind is that even though you'll see on a poster something like, all right, American ales have about 80% attenuation. That's just for that one wort. And so if you're brewing that one pale ale that we brew, yeah, you're going to expect that range. But it doesn't mean that that's the only thing, that's the maximum attenuation that strain can do. Something like a London 3, we call it Brit 5. I think we quote it maybe 70-75% attenuation. And for that one wort, that's where it is. But like if you put it in a seltzer, it'll go to 100. So that's just something to keep in mind, that like what you feed that yeast matters. That's kind of where it's in sort of a happy zone. It's where it's going to be predictable for most beers. But depending on how you set that table, you can get very different ranges of attenuation. And so one of the big things to keep in mind is that the attenuations that we post are really just kind of a relative scale. So if you're looking for something to have a bunch of residual sugar, pick something on like the low end of our scale, or converse. Obviously, one thing that really plays into attenuation is your yeast performance. And it's just all the typical yeast health things that we always quote. Big thing, pitch rate. So you don't want to underpitch, because then obviously you end up with diacetyl, and you end up with acetaldehyde, all the things you know about. You want to make sure you have good yeast health as you're going in. You want to make sure to oxygenate enough. So typical recommendation is about 10 ppm, depending on what you're looking at. That tends to be 0.5 to 1 LPM kind of thing feeding in. Talk to your yeast providers about this. There are strains that are known to need more oxygen. One of them, for example, is London 3. So then you might want to vary that depending on your process. Lagers also a little higher than ales. You're going to need nutrients. I mean, if you're trying to just ferment seltzers, trying to do just glucose, this thing's not going to want to ferment. You're going to need a nitrogen source. You need vitamins, you need minerals, that kind of a thing. And then obviously temperature is going to affect all of that. If you're either way too cold or way too hot, your yeast are going to be pissed off. They're not going to do their job. Nobody wants that. And then just understand what they can and can't do. There's a point when you're gonna kill your yeast, or they just don't have the pieces to be able to put together a fermentation to either create more of themselves or to create the alcohol that you want. So if you have something crazy high gravity, like make sure you have a strain that can handle that. Not everything can. If you're doing a seltzer, make sure you have all the nutrients that you need. And again, if you're doing sour ales, make sure that you have a pH tolerant strain. So you want to keep it above about 3.2, or else the yeast really gets sad. I know I talked to a lot of you guys about souring strains and whether you can repitch them in the last couple of days, and that's just something that we don't tend to recommend, just because the cells are so unhappy at the end of it. Also, for whatever reason, they really hate acetic acid. So they can tolerate lactic acid way better than they can tolerate acetic acid. So also something to keep in mind. All right, so now we're going to go through kind of taking what we've learned, and then going through some challenging scenarios that you might come across. Specifically, we're going to be talking about hop creep, higher ABV beers, non-alcoholic, low-alcoholic beers, and saisons using non-diastatic yeast. And I'm going to focus on some of these more than the others, just because it tends to be where people have asked questions in the past, but we'll go through all of them. The first is hop creep. So obviously, this has been a big topic for quite a while, now that we're dumping all these hops in all these beers. The big challenge is that when you dry hop, it can lead to higher than expected attenuation. And the idea is that the hops are bringing along enzymes that when you think you've gotten into fermentation, you're bringing along the same kind of enzymes that were in the malt. And so you're getting additional fermentable sugars. So if you're bringing along, for example, we don't exactly know which enzymes are coming along, but we do know that we get creation of maltose and glucose after a dry hop. And so the idea is to manage this, right? The idea is to design beers to either take advantage of this, so to realize that it's going to happen and just plan for it, or to prevent it. There are some things that you don't have a whole lot of control about as a brewer. So, I mean, you don't generally get to pick your own hop lot. Obviously there's lots of different hop products out there, but like some can be used when in the hot side, some can be used in the cold side. You don't always have control over like the ones you want to use where you can. You don't get to control kilning or how they were processed, and you don't know how they were grown. You never know like where what field they were in or what kind of enzyme they ended up with. There are a lot of things you can control, so you can control your yeast choice, how you made your wort, your dry hop dose rate, your dry hop timing, and your hop variety choice. And all of those do impact your hop creep. I'm not going to go into all of them. We do have a talk that goes into all of that in detail. If you are interested, hit me up. I can send you the PDF. But we're going to go into a couple little things here just to kind of talk about these ideas. So one of the main things you can do to control hop creep, which is obviously like over attenuation when you don't want it, is to pick a yeast that's not going to have a lot of potential for hop creep. So you have a larger degree of hop creep potential with a lower attenuating yeast. So for example, right here on the left is Chico, and right here is Brit 5, which is our London 3. You can see that in the lighter color is the end of the fermentation without a dry hop, and then the darker ones are with a dry hop. And I want you to think about kind of the difference right here as potential for hop creep. So that's the difference between, it looked like it finished at 3.5 without a dry hop, and all the way down to 1.5 with a dry hop. And all of that is because of the enzymes that came along for the ride. So if you're looking to not have a lot of hop creep, choose something that has less potential for hop creep. A couple other things that are kind of interesting here, with the exception of this guy over here, which is diastatic, the finishing point for all of the dry hop samples are right at about the same point. So the non-dry hop samples, they kind of ran out of enzyme, right? But once you got the additional enzyme from the dry hop, they all got to about the same point, telling you that it's like substrate limited, right? That they used up everything that they could and got down to the bottom. It's also interesting, so then down here, the difference between up here and down here shows you the effect of the style enzyme. So it was able to ferment those additional dextrins. Yeah. Yeah, of course.
Great presentation, by the way.
Appreciate it.
Curious, on the last slide, you
Yeah.
mentioned larger degree of hop creep potential with lower attenuating yeast.
Right. So basically, there's more residual sugars left for the enzymes that come along with hops to act upon.
I guess my kind of question is, in your experience, does less fermentable wort equate to a larger degree of hop creep potential?
It depends on what kind of less fermentable wort you created, I guess, and the kind of enzymes that are coming along for the ride. Less fermentable wort just means that like you have larger sugars that are remaining, and the enzymes come along for the ride are digesting those into fermentable bits, right? And so it just depends on whether or not the enzymes coming along for the ride can act upon those sugars. In general, the answer is yes, that they can cleave it back into fermentable sugars just like the malt enzymes can. So creating a non-fermentable wort isn't going to fix your problem, if that's what you're getting at.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I was just curious if like I made wort less fermentable, would hop creep kind of negate that purpose?
Yes.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Right, yes. So the way that you made the wort less fermentable is that you controlled the enzymes in the beginning so that you left more long sugars, right? Now you don't have the opportunity to control the enzymes. You chuck those enzymes in there. And so what you thought you were controlling in the beginning, you're no longer in control of. And so the cuts that you were stopping in the beginning are now happening, and you're getting those free sugars for consumption. Cool. All right, cool. So your yeast choice matters, and your hop choice matters. Different hops bring along a different enzyme package. So something like a Citra down here has a low potential for hop creep. It brings along fewer enzymes. And something like a Cascade up here has a high potential for hop creep because it brings along more enzymes. And this was work that was done by Yakima Chief. I'm sure lots of your hop vendors have done this kind of work. If you're interested in either maximizing your hop creep for whatever reason in order to dry something out, or if you want to minimize it, talk to them. I'm sure everybody has this comparable kind of a graph. The other thing that's kind of interesting is the kind of product that you use matters. You get more creep with a T90 than you do with a more processed product like an extract. And yeah, the idea is that you can do this two ways, right? You can either realize that you're going to have hop creep and just roll with it. So one of the ways that we kind of accommodate hop creep is by adding our dry hops a little bit earlier, and that lets you get your hop creep out of the way during fermentation. And what's good about that is that you clear out your diacetyl kind of during the regular diacetyl clearance. So that would be the way we would kind of suggest that you ride out your hop creep. The other one is that you can try and prevent hop creep. There are lots of ways of doing this. Probably the one that we recommend is to do a very cold, short dry hop. And then if you can, maybe flash pasteurize. There was a pasteurization talk earlier that showed that as long as you have like low DO, that there's not a whole lot of flavor difference. And maybe do it in concert with an ALDC expressing yeast. We have a DKO series at Omega. Other makers, and Berkeley makes one as well. Or just combine it with an ALDC exogenous enzyme. And that's the kind of approach you might want to use for like a hazy or a NEPA, obviously. So cool. Next scenario are big stouts. I mean, everybody's making these things. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but the idea is just that these things are hard to ferment. And there are some tricks you can do to make sure that you're getting to the attenuation range that you want. Or you can just take advantage of the fact that you know that you're not going to get great attenuation and get those big, sweet, sticky stouts that everybody kind of wants right now. So a couple challenges. Obviously, you're bringing along dark malts for the ride. They lead to a decrease in pH, so that can cause your enzymes to not be as effective. You have a really low water to grist ratio because you're dumping so much malt in there, and super high ABV. So at the end, your yeast don't really like working because the alcohol content is so high. Approaches to kind of dealing with that and trying to maximize your attenuation. Make sure and correct your pH. Get your pH up into that like 5.3 zone if you can. Consider a no sparge approach. The idea there is just shifting as much of your sparge water into the mash as you can to try and get a better grist ratio. Make sure you're pitching enough. So for these big guys, you might want to pitch as much as double to make sure that you're getting enough yeast cells in there. And then, if you're going for really sweet, maybe just embrace this. Just plan ahead and realize that you're not going to get the attenuation that you think. But maybe you can work with your recipe in order to design a beer around that. The next are either non-alcoholic or low alcohol beers, also known as NABLAB. The biggest thing here is not that you're not getting enough attenuation, obviously, but that you're getting over attenuation. There are a lot of strategies for how to overcome that and how to make non-alcoholic or low alcoholic beers. One that we recommend, and I'm going to go through the most here, is using a limited wort fermentability approach. The general idea, and we'll go through it a little more in the next couple of slides, is first you mash crazy high. This is like 185, 200, way up there. The first time that this was kind of broached to me when people said mash high, I was like, like 162, like 164, cool. No, like really, really up there. You want to target a super low starting gravity so that you don't give it a bunch of sugars to work with. So in the 4 to 6 Plato range. Maintain a normal pH range for your mash. And the idea here is, again, to make sure your enzymes are active. But then make sure your finished beer is under 4.2 for safety purposes. I think everybody is drilling that point home these days. And then there's options to use a low attenuating strain, so something that's maltotriose negative. And that would be the ones that are sort of in that 60 to 70% range, kind of maybe those British ales we were talking about, but there's also other ones in that kind of family. That's one way to do it without having to have any kind of special equipment or any kind of special strain. But there are also maltose negative yeast out there that are definitely options. Lots of vendors have those. One option is to try a souring strain. The idea there is that you push some of these sugars into acid production instead of into alcohol production. So it's just, if you're like right on that threshold of being a little bit too high, it actually just, you get souring instead. Or, obviously, spend the big bucks and get some equipment. But most of us, I think, right now are attempting to do this sort of on a DIY scale, and this is going to be some tips for that. I'm going to go through these two papers and just a couple of figures out of them. The PDF will be available to you guys, and so you'll have that whenever you want, but that's just the source for some of this stuff. Like I said, we're going to go through this limited wort fermentability approach. And the idea is just to get beyond the active range of these enzymes. So you want to push it all the way to the right when you don't have a lot of activity. So you want to be sort of like above, like we're going to say 160, but you'll see here like the effects of that getting even higher. And then combining it with either maltose negative or maltotriose negative yeast. So in the first paper, they compared 3 different mash regimes. The first and the second aren't that strange. They're not that different from what we do in the regular brewing scale. So they go, they cover the gamut between 144 and 162. But in the last one that I really want you to pay attention to, they do one single step mash, or one single infusion mash at 162. The results are here. So on the left is maltotriose, and on the right is maltose. And you can see the red line is obviously way lower than the other ones. So mashing it as high as 162 gives you way less maltotriose and maltose. However, when you actually look at the ABV that was produced over here, I don't know if you can read that, but in the isothermal approach there, you still get 2.8%. And this is using just like a typical ale strain. So if you're going to do something where you're doing sort of a conservative high mash, that like 162 range, you're going to need to combine that with a maltose negative yeast in order to get below that 0.5 threshold. But that is like an approach that some people will do, but it's one that where you can't just do it with a typical brewing strain. In the next paper, they push it even further. So they took a look at very high mash temp on the content and composition of their dextrins and fermentable sugars. In this case, they were looking to maximize their dextrins because that really will help with the mouthfeel of an NA beer. They looked at 3 different temperature ranges between 172 and 200 degrees Fahrenheit. They did additionally add a thermostable alpha amylase, and the idea there is just to make sure that you're getting all your starch hydrolyzed. Regular oil grist ratio. The results here, so as you're going to the right, you're getting warmer. The yellow bars are dextrins, and the blue bars are fermentable sugars. So you can see the inverse relationship here. So the fermentable sugars are going down as you're mashing higher, and your dextrins are going up as you're mashing higher. So definitely some evidence over here for a very, very high mash temp. You also get way higher molecular weight dextrins. So again, temperature going over to the right is getting higher. The light colors are low molecular weight dextrins, and the dark colors are high molecular weight dextrins. So as you get warmer, you also get bigger dextrins. Again, sort of a mouthfeel enhancement. And then this is the quantification of the kind of sugars that are in there. So glucose is white, and then you get fructose, sucrose, maltose, and maltotriose. And it's pretty clear that as you go to the highest temperatures over here, you're really minimizing production of these fermentable sugars. So the main result here is that like when you're mashing at 200, you get a more complex dextrin, so you get increased body, and a substantial decrease in both your maltose and your glucose. So you end up with something less sweet and like with a lower ABV. What you want to do in this case is combine this with your 4 to 6 Plato original gravity. They had a 12 Plato gravity in this case and still saw a couple of ABV. So this is a way where you can, if you paired this with a 5 Plato wort, even with the standard brewing strain, you'll end up at below 0.5. So mash at 200, 5 Plato original gravity, regular old strain, you should be able to make an NA beer. And then the last one are saisons without Sta 1+ strains. So I really like saisons, but I understand that some people don't like to bring diastatic yeast into their brew house. So the challenge is, how do you make a saison without a diastatic yeast? If you guys call us with that, we typically will recommend a Belgian strain or other kind of saison alternative to kind of approximate that sort of lightly phenolic character that comes along with the saison a lot of times. You can mash super low to try and create a very fermentable wort. Add something like dextrose to the boil, which is another word for glucose, so that you make sure that you're getting a really fermentable wort. You can use an exogenous enzyme, and that in this case, glucoamylase is the way to go. And take advantage of hop creep. So add a little bit of a dry hop on there. I know a hoppy table beer is like one of my favorite beers out there, so this is a great opportunity to explore that style. Cool, so those were some of the special cases we were going through. So just a couple conclusions. If you're thinking about your attenuation, you're making a beer you like, but you didn't quite make it the way that you wanted, think about, was it your grist? Did you actually open up those the grains the way you wanted and get access to your starch, access to your dextrins? Check all your mash temps. Make sure you didn't walk away during your mash. Make sure your pH was good, grist ratio. Make sure you mashed out. Check for hop creep. Make sure you're taking it into account. Make sure your yeast are healthy. Make sure you added some nutrients. And make sure you chose the right strain, because we learned that different yeast like to eat different kinds of sugars. Also, just thinking about if you're making one of these complicated ones, the kind of tools and tricks that you can do to get the beer that you want. And like I said, this is kind of like two sides to it. It's the work that you make, and it's the yeast that you choose. It's kind of like setting the dinner table and dealing with a picky toddler, right? You know these kids only like to eat what they want. Make sure you're giving it to them so you can get the beer that you want. And this is Laura's take. So you can become master of both. These are the yeast you were looking for. You guys have to tell her that I did that because it was embarrassing. That's all I gotta tell you. Anyway, nope. Anyway, thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
I have a question, and it's kind of follows up on that, but as it pertains to any beers.
Yeah.
So you were controlling the fermentability on it, but now if you dry hop any beer, that mash could look 200.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do hop stuff, would definitely recommend using some of the modern hop products, the extracts on the hot side. Yeah, so definitely avoid a dry hop if you're trying to make an Eddie beer. Yeah. Yeah. One in the back.
Could you say a little bit more about the heat-stable alpha amylase enzyme that was added in that and the NA beer?
I would love to tell you more about that, but that wasn't our paper. I just wanted to make sure and bring it up because it was something that they mentioned as being pretty common in those in order to make sure that you got complete starch hydrolysis. I don't have familiarity with it. I did put the reference on there. If you want to dig back into their methods, it's in there. Well, cool. I mean, last talk of the day. Thanks for hanging out, guys.